I'm really delighted this evening to be sharing about the archaeology on site. Marble Hill is being revived, which is so exciting. It means the house is open for free for 5 days a week. It will also mean that we're investing in our landscape. We will have a lovely cafe, which is due to open in next spring. How exciting is it to say that? And our house will be open in the spring of 22. We're also investing in people. So we've got a number of different apprenticeships, everything from horticultural apprenticeships to cafe, to childcare apprenticeships that are taking place as part of the Marble Hill Revived project. And there's a host of events to get involved in. Many are free. So do watch out for our website. But without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to the wonderful Thomas Cromwell, who's been working on site and has been an extension of the Marble Hill family. He's a very experienced archaeologist, and he has inspired our volunteers as part of their training as we explore our archaeology on site. And tonight he is wearing the most amazing Christmas jumper, so which I might ask him to just reveal.
There you go.
So we're feeling festive. So it's lovely to introduce you to the wonderful Thomas Cromwell. So take it away and tell us a bit more about the ice seat.
Okay, right. Well, I'm going to start sharing a presentation. As Rachel's introduced, my name is Tom. My email address, should anyone find any questions later that you felt that you should have asked in the chat but didn't get around to, you can always pop emails across. It's thomas.cromwell@historicengland.org.uk. I'm an archaeologist with Historic England in the archaeological projects team, which means that I get to organize and work on projects on fascinating sites up and down the country, places like Dover Castle, Battle Abbey, all sorts of interesting places, and gardens such as Chiswick House and Rest Park up in Bedfordshire, if anyone's familiar with that, and of course Marble Hill, which is a lovely place to work, if of course you like parakeets. We got involved in this project to start with fairly early on, about 4 years ago, just when the whole Marble Hill Revived concept was coming alive. And we've been involved quite heavily with trying to tie features that appear in some of the early mapping to physical entities on site in order to guide how the site gets restored. And we did quite a bit of excavation in 2017, and then have come back a month ago. We did some excavation. You may have seen some of the work that we were doing down the side of the ice house and the 9-pin alley. So, all right, this is the site. If you're familiar with Marble Hill, which most of you hopefully will be, you'll recognize it from the air. A particularly parched summer, this one. We have the house here in the middle, obviously, in the landscape, the River Thames down at the bottom. And the reason for the house being where it is, of course, is that Henrietta Howard, who built the house, was involved in the court of George I and the Prince of Wales, who later became George II. And because they were based up at Hampton Court, riverside property up and down this stretch of the Thames suddenly became very important. And this site that had been a series of different fields and meadows became an important place to snap up and build a stately home within easy reach by boat of the court. And we were looking at several features. One of them is the ice house, which is just here on the map, number 1, which had a seat in front of it, apparently. The next one is the 9-pin alley, which we'll be talking about in January, in the next installment of these lectures. There are some arbors, or pergolas, as you might describe them, that bracketed the central lawn in front of the house, and we were looking at them. And of course, the grotto, which was only rediscovered in the 1980s, having been infilled and effectively lost for about a century. And we started work on these in 2017, and then things stopped for a number of reasons, and we've finally gotten to come back and do more work on them as the overall building works sort of take hold. Now, the thing that spurred all of this on was the discovery of this 1749 map. It's been dated variously to 1750 or 1752 as it was when I first got involved with the project, but I think the consensus now is that it was probably drawn up about 1749 as part of legal issues to do with land transfers to acquire the last pieces of what are now the Marble Hill estate. And it was drawn up by the surveyor to the Duke of Argyll, who acted as essentially the money holder for Henrietta Howard. He was the man who controlled her estate and helped her purchase all of this site and develop it. And it was his surveyor that did this. And the key things with the map in this particular view, first off, it's oriented north-south, straight through from the house down to the river, which of course the real site isn't. And we'll see that in a minute when I show it slightly more geo-referenced to which way it actually faces. The second thing to note about it is that all the detail is in the bottom center portion of the map, which is the pleasure gardens, the ornamental part of the estate, or at least as of 1749. And in the top left-hand corner, you can see there's a handwritten key explaining what the various features are. And the reason for that is if we look in detail at the pleasure gardens in the map, you can see they've all got letters telling us what they are in the key, which is quite useful information. It's the earliest map that we have that may represent the site as built, rather than there's an earlier design by Alexander Pope, which was what could have been built at the site in the 1720s, but apparently wasn't built. So this is the first as constructed plan that we seem to have. And you'll notice it's got the usual idiosyncrasies. The house is drawn as a facade rather than looking down on the roof. And a number of features are drawn in that weird perspective. But the interesting bit for tonight is the ice house, which is this red circle here in the top left, lettered C. And when we started this, we'd identified that as something we wanted to look for. We know where the ice house itself is because it's still there. But it has in front of it, you can just about make this out in the text, but if I make it a bit clearer, the key says, a seat before the ice house in the thicket. And you'll see the way it's drawn, there's some sort of ornamental, elaborate structure with what looks like shrubbery behind it. Okay, and looking at it, this is obviously the front door, well, the north side of the ice house. It's got the entrance door that allows you to get into harvest ice. And ice houses became a big thing in Britain, more or less about the time of the restoration of the monarchy, when Charles II came over in 1660. He'd grown up effectively in the Netherlands and in France, and he brought with him their tradition of having ice houses. There were other ice houses in Britain before then, but it wasn't a big thing on country estates until then. And it then becomes almost an expected feature on any country estate in this country from, say, the late 17th century right the way through to the end of the 19th century, when the advent of mechanical refrigeration kills off the need to harvest ice every winter. And the idea is that you collect up the ice from ponds and streams and you store it in a hole in the ground that's well insulated, and that takes advantage of one of the peculiar quirks of geology, in that if you go down far enough into the soil, the temperature seems to stabilize regardless of time of year, and it stays at about 4 or 5 degrees above zero, above freezing, basically. Which means if you then put a little bit of insulation in, your ice can last a long time, hopefully into the summer for cocktail season. And on the right-hand side of this slide is the illustration that was on the sign, which is currently laying on the ground in front of the ice house during the restoration works, showing what a typical ice house would have looked like in a weird sort of way. It does look suspicious like a coal mine, which it shouldn't. And if we look at this illustration, which was drawn by Sir John Soane, the designer of the Bank of England in the 1790s, we can see a sort of typical layout. You have the main body of the ice house, which is a tapered section, sort of getting narrower at the bottom, which starts at the ground surface usually and goes down from there to a reasonable depth. And above that, you have a dome over the top of the ice house above ground, because you have to have some way in. So you have your doorway and your steps coming in. And the dome, of course, is the most efficient structure that you can put over a given space to minimize the surface area and thus reduce the amount of heat that's getting in to melt your ice. And then you put something over the top of it to act as insulation. In this case, he's drawn some sort of odd pyramid or cone shape. Ours has a big mound of soil on top of it. And then down at the bottom, you have a sump, because the ice is going to melt whether you like it or not. And the idea is if you have enough ice in there, it's only melting at the edges, and you want that water to run away and the ice not to sit in it so it doesn't melt prematurely. And at the bottom, you'd have a grate of some sort to hold up the ice and create a sort of sump at the bottom that the water could drain into, and then from there, hopefully come out through a drainage pipe somewhere to be disposed of. And ours, if we look in through the doorway, this is at ground level, you can see at the back, there's a black metal grill, and that's in front of the hole into the dome itself. And at the far side of the dome, we can see that there's brickwork above that's exposed, and then below it's all been rendered, but it's brickwork underneath that as well. And that line of division is about ground level, it works out. So ours is following the standard form, and it mostly is below ground. And if we look down into it, we can see it tapers down. It's not so much a cone shape, it's more of an egg shape, sort of an egg stood up on its little end. And down at the bottom of it, we then get a circular sort of brick sump. And there would have been a grill across the top of that to keep the ice out of the water at the bottom. So it's fairly standard stuff. And if we look at it on the map, this has now been twisted around to the right orientation to match with the Ordnance Survey. We can see our ornamental archway drawn on the front of the thicket that has the ice house within it. And it's at the top end of an avenue of trees that runs down the west side of the ornamental gardens in order to give a view down to the river, or if you're at the river, a view up to this structure sitting in front of the ice house. Now, there are examples of what it could have looked like. This one at Rest Park is a lovely seat. Basically, it's a brick semicircular structure with a seat around the inside of it, and a nice dressed brick facade on it, done in classical style. And it's just a freestanding structure, and obviously it would have several layers of brick foundation underneath it, which is what we were kind of hoping to find when we started work on the ice house last month. What we don't know about our structure, given that we know Henrietta Howard was chronically short of money during the construction of the site, and that the ice house was certainly being built in the 1720s because it's written about by Jonathan Swift in 1727. We don't know whether she would have built a brick structure like this at a time when, to be honest, brick was hard to get hold of in London, because London had been undergoing a heavy sort of rebuilding after the Great Fire in 1666. Bricks were still a bit difficult to get hold of. Often people would be reusing bricks, recycling them from demolished buildings such as the nearby Richmond Palace that disappeared not long before this site got built. And they would have been an expensive commodity, basically, for her. So it may well have been a timber structure, simply covered in stucco or some other facade material that could then be made to look like stonework. And as long as it's well maintained, it could be up there for 20, 30, 50 years, who knows? So it may not have been a brick structure, and it may not have had substantial foundations as a result. But we can't tell from the limited information that we've got. And of course, there's always the question, was it ever there? The consensus at the moment is that the 1749 map represents an as-built study of the site rather than a speculative, here's what we could build for you, sort of proposal for the site. So we're working on the assumption that it was actually there at the time that the site was mapped in the 1740s. Right, so if we go back to that corner of the plan that shows the ice house and we overlay it with contour lines from a recent survey, you'll see that round the top and the sides of the ice house, the contour lines are quite tightly bunched, indicating a fairly steep slope. But coming south towards where the letter C is in front of the ornamental seat, they spread out a bit, leading to a much gentler slope and almost a sort of step, sort of halfway down the slope. And that's heading towards the avenue of trees and seems a likely place that the seat could have been built perhaps slightly elevated so as to have more of a commanding view down to the river. And we placed our trenches, trench 7, which is the rectangular one down the bottom, we dug in 2017, and it was the only space at the time that was free enough of shrubs that we were allowed to dig in. Unfortunately, because of the way the tree protection works on this site, we are limited in where we can work at any one time, because we have to conserve the trees that are going to be kept, and we have to conserve the environment that the nesting birds and other animals use. Even though large amounts of the underlying shrubbery and the self-seeded materials from recent years was okay to clear away, we didn't want to damage any of the existing trees. So the squiggly trench on the south edge of the ice house itself, that's what happens when you start with a 7 by 7 meter square trench and then remove all the nibbles of root protection from all the trees that are still standing and that we want to keep. It still meant, though, that we had a section all the way down from nearly the top of the mound right the way out onto the flat. So had there been any layers of construction, any foundations, any pads associated with it, we should have intersected them with our trench. That's the plan. So we're reasonably okay with the shape of where we were allowed to work. And this is looking at the ice house from the south. The mats that you see in the foreground are protection for where we put the spoil heap on top of it, so it didn't compress the soil and damage any roots for the area, that was going to regrow once we were done. And this is looking northwards up the mound itself, and you can see the sides are fairly steeply sloped, east and west. However, if we turn around and look at it from the side, from the east side, we're looking across. The south is now to the left on the picture, and you can see it does actually have a much more shallow profile. And if I add that as a line, you can see the way it almost flattens out halfway down to a sort of platform, where I thought, hopefully, we might find some sort of remnants of an ice house seat. You'll also see that there are trees planted directly in the top of the mound, and other small trees that nibbled away at our working area, but that we didn't want to disturb because obviously, the ecology on the site is fairly important. So we opened up the footprint that we did have and came down straight onto brick earth all the way across the trench, which is it's the natural soil for the area. Essentially, it's windblown dust that comes off the London clay and settles down. And in the summer, it's a dry, dusty material. In the winter, when it gets wet, it gets claggy and almost, but not quite clayey in its behavior. And it was quite heavily sort of dug up by roots from all the trees that have self-seeded over the years. But what we did notice in it was there was no evidence of any features cut into it. There was no interruption of it for a structure that was built or removed. So instead of taking the whole thing down, we decided to put a slot through it to see what was going on in profile. And this is us partway down. The rods on the right-hand side are 1 meter long with half-meter color bands. The one across the top is 2 meters long to give you an idea of scale of the trench. So basically, it's about waist high standing inside there. And what we've got is basically a series of brick earth deposits. And then there's some yellow sand, yellow builder's sand, which is unnatural for this area. It is not what you find here. It's normally a layer cake of brick earth, sand, more sort of sharp orangey sands and gravels, heading down eventually a few meters, well, probably about a dozen meters or so down in Marble Hill to get down to the London clay. So the yellow sand was a bit odd. It's obviously been imported and it's something to do with construction. And if we look at it from the other side, well, after we've gone a bit deeper, you can see it's just one wedge, one band of material that follows an odd contour where it's dipping down to the north, down towards the ice house itself, as if it's filling a hole. And we'll talk about that again in a moment. But the interesting thing to note here is that the red and white photo scales at the bottom there, which are half-meter long scales, they are at a depth that's about 30 centimeters or a foot in old money below the average ground surface outside of the ice house itself. So we are down below what was presumably the construction level for the ice house and for the main house in the 1720s. So if we were going to see anything, we should have seen it by now. And this is just to show the bottom end of the trench heading south towards our old trench, which is just behind where the yellow tripod is. Again, was just brick earth all the way across. We did not find any evidence of any structures whatsoever in there. And we were perplexed by this, but I have a theory as to why that is, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, but we did find things in the trench. Glass, obviously this is a modern-ish 20th century bottle top. I think a milk bottle, to be honest, which came out of the top. So we did find some slightly earlier glass that would not be amiss in the 18th century. We found a lot of fragments of pottery. This is all what's known as Delftware, essentially tin glazed earthenwares, which were a popular sort of high-end form of pottery prior to the arrival in the mid 18th century of proper porcelain coming out of China, at which point Delftware becomes a bit, well, it drops down the social class, shall we say, as proper porcelain takes its place. And unfortunately, it's manufactured from the 16th century right the way up to the end of the 18th century, as far as I can tell. So we may be able to more closely date some of the sherds of pottery, but there's no guarantees. However, it is about the right sort of period for the construction of the house. And we were getting this through all the brick earth, right the way down, even into the pre-house brick earth. We also had clay pipes, which are infinitely more datable, usually to the nearest decade if we're lucky. Early-ish forms where the bowls tend to lean forward quite a bit and are fairly small. This one has a maker's stamp on the bottom, which looks like a heart with the letters G and O, probably, although it's hard to tell, stamped into the bottom. So we should be able to tie that down to exactly who made it, where they made it, and when they made it, if we're lucky, which will date some of the deposits we had. And as part of the process, we also did another topographic survey of the mound to get fresh data now that the mound has been completely cleared of vegetation, because the earlier topographic surveys suffered from the fact that there were only so many points you could actually see to go in and survey, whereas now it's a lot more open. And you'll see there's a tripod in the doorway because we also set up an instrument to zap a few points on the inside face of the brickwork within the ice house, so we could see exactly where that was in relation to our trench. It wants a proper laser scan at some point, but that's beyond the scope of this particular project. That's my colleague Kevin doing the surveying in there. And between us, we have a theory, because we looked up inside the ice house, in addition to looking down, and there is evidence to suggest that that domed ceiling has been repaired at various points in time. It looks somewhat patched. And the brickwork, some of it does seem rather later than what we would expect in the 1720s. And this leads to the suspicion that perhaps what we're actually looking at on the south side of the mound isn't the original 1720s mound that doesn't have an ice house seat, but instead a mound where it's been opened in order to get at the brickwork for repairs, because the only way you can fix a broken dome in an ice house like that would be to take all the soil off the top of it to expose it, so you could get in and take it apart and rebuild it. And that what we're looking at is the yellow sand may well be leftover building material from reworking the brickwork. So maybe late 18th or probably 19th century. It's a very thick wodge of very clean yellow sand. It's not mixed in as you'd expect with other contaminants. So it's literally come off the back of a lorry or a cart, been put in a pile, and then has been shoveled in here by the wheelbarrow load without any interruption with it mixing with other soils. And that if you extend along, we had a slight boundary within the brick earth. It's difficult to tell the difference in the various levels of brick earth, but there's a boundary edge there, and everything effectively above that and above the yellow sand is what got put back in the hole after they had fixed whatever damage they had to fix on the ice house dome. And then what we get below that is a layer of brick earth that may be to do with the original construction of the ice house, but which has been truncated by them digging out the structure at a later date. And so it's that bit there that I've just highlighted with a red squiggle. And then everything below that, I think, is the ground surface that was here when Henrietta Howard first started building. It still has artifacts in it. It still has bits of pottery and pipe and things, and bits of roof tile. And that's partly because prior to Henrietta buying up the site, it was all open fields being used for market gardens and things. People were bringing out their midden heaps, the rubbish that you chucked out the back door of the kitchen of your house would be carted out to the fields every season and plowed in. So you'd get broken bits of clay pipe, which of course are designed almost by the manufacturer to break, so you have to buy another one. And your broken bits of crockery, etc., which wind up in the fields and then are part of the soil when they come to construct the house. At least that's my current working interpretation as to why we're not seeing structure. I think it probably was there, but was removed. And when they removed it, they put the soil back, and we've lost all the evidence. Had it been a brick structure, it maybe they've harvested out all the bricks and they've gone somewhere else and only soil went back in the hole. So we won't necessarily know whether it was brick or timber based on what evidence we have left. It's negative, but it is still evidence, and it still tells what I think is probably the story of the ice house seat. Okay, and just a shameless plug for next month, of course, we're going to be talking about the 9-pin alley. And I think at this point, if I stop the slideshow, yep, and the screen sharing is finished, and I'll hand over to Rachel to pass on any questions you might have.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Thomas. It's been it's fascinating to see what you've uncovered, and also to understand a bit more about our ice house on site. So thank you for sharing that with us. We've got a question from one of our people on the call, and she lives in Thamesford, and she's got a shell grotto, which is grade 2 listed. So it's literally down the road from
Very nice.
But it's in a really bad state of repair, and it's on the Heritage at Risk register. And she knows that the previous owners were friends with Alexander Pope and Henrietta, and was wondering in your for whether you could possibly give any advice as to how she could pursue understanding a little bit more, and who would be the people to contact to understand. I've put her in. I've sent her a message about sending some information to me as the audience development manager at English Heritage. But in terms of historic England, what would be the best thing to do?
That's a tricky one. I mean, I personally would like to know more about that particular grotto, because, as I say, we will be investigating the grotto at Marble Hill, where we know it was discovered and rebuilt in the 1980s, minus almost all of its internal decoration, unfortunately, which wound up in a pile behind the ranger's hut. So it would be nice to know more about the other grottos in the neighborhood. I mean, we know Pope's Grotto is occasionally open to the public and is rather more substantially preserved. If the question is to do with decoration, then I think probably asking our team in the first instance, send me an email, for example. I see Nicola Hembry, who is our finds specialist and also currently head of the archaeological projects team, is on this Zoom call as well, and no doubt would be interested. And we can then field the information and perhaps find others to put your person in contact with. And it depends as well. I mean, is it about restoring the decoration, or is it a more structural thing? Is there any danger that the actual sort of structure of the grotto needs repairs? In which case, again, it'd be worth asking us, and we'd be happy to provide information. If that helps.
So thank you, Thomas. I think Lucy, if you're able to do that, that would be super. So that, because it'd be great to understand a little bit more. And we are so lucky to work very closely with particularly Pope's Grotto, and shameless other plug. We're doing the Thames Luminaries, where we are sharing with 9 historic organisations some information about landscapes. So do look out for that. But it would be amazing to understand a bit more. So thank you, Lucy, for piquing our interest. How wonderful. I've got another question, just to say, are there really no written records about the repair? Because it seems like it certainly from looking at that amazing picture that you've shown us, Thomas, it looks like there was definitely a repair there, and certainly it sounds like there's definite evidence in the ground. This particular person on the line says, kind of, it looks like lots of the trees were self-seeded and not planted, kind of, and they love trees, but can't we just take up a few? And just in response to that,
If only.
we're working really hard as part of the landscape works to preserve as many trees as we possibly can, and indeed plant over 300 more, along with lots of native hedgerow, and also lots of just other hedgerows and plants, to make sure that we are really safeguarding our habitats within Marble Hill. It's really important that we are able to safeguard our 66 acres, so that it is a real space for animals and insects and birds, just as much as our wonderful community. So I'm afraid we just can't get rid of our wonderful trees. But Thomas, do you think you could possibly tell us about whether you know any more about any written records?
Unfortunately, no. There has been quite a bit of documentary research leading up to the whole restoration project. And while some archives exist, obviously something that would have been considered sort of routine maintenance almost may well have just fallen below the radar. It might have existed in the landscape manager's daybook or his accounts for that year, but that's the sort of thing that people don't tend to hang on to for more than sort of their working life. You get to the point where you think, oh, I've got to clear all this clutter out. And if you're lucky, it survives in a book of accounts somewhere in a stately home archive. And if you're not lucky, it goes in the bonfire at the end of the year or the end of the decade, or whenever it is they do their regular clear outs, because it wouldn't have been seen as significant work at that time. It would have just been, well, we have an ice house, as everyone else does, and it's got a bit of damage. Send the gardeners out with some shovels, dig it out, we'll get the brickie in, he'll fix it, and then we'll bury it again. So it may not have left any written record, any evidence whatsoever of having happened. And that's what archaeology is about, unfortunately. We try to unravel the things that aren't documented, that aren't handed down as known truth, because people didn't feel they were important enough, but they still leave physical evidence in the ground. So we have to, almost as detectives, try to unpick that in order to understand what's in the soil and what it's telling us.
Lovely.
And on the subject of the trees, it's worth noting as well that none of the trees in the park at the moment, with one or two possible exceptions, were there in Henrietta Howard's lifetime, simply because of how far back that was. And they're almost all 19th or 20th century. The smaller ones in particular will have been 20th century self-seeded trees when the council took over. However, quite a few of them are actually in the right place to replicate the various avenues that we know were planted. So there's always that difficulty. Do we take them out and recreate the map exactly? Or do we accept the fact that these are mature, beautiful trees, part of the ecosystem, in roughly the right place, and they may not be the right species for what was originally planted. The walnut avenue down to the river is no longer walnut. They may not be the right trees, but they're good trees. So do we keep them because they're the trees we're used to, rather than removing them because historically they're not pure? Bearing in mind, in Henrietta Howard's lifetime, she probably never saw a mature tree on her site anyway. They don't grow that fast. So, she'd have seen them installed as significant saplings, maybe, a few inches across. But it would have taken most of her lifetime for them to grow into the sorts of trees that we see now.
I mean, we do believe that the black walnut, yeah, as it's 300 years old, would have probably been the tree that would have been there as a sapling when she was there. But that's a specific tree. And if you'd like to find out more, do go to the Marble Hill YouTube channel, and you can hear Kate Slack, our head gardener, talk a bit more about that. Thomas, I've got just one last question,
Okay.
and it's just to kind of to say that, do we think the ice house seat was lost when the workmen repaired the roof? Do we think that that's...
Probably. My guess, and this is part of the problem with negative evidence, is all you can do is work on supposition and most likely possibilities. My guess is that, given that Henrietta Howard was always a bit short of money, we know the house stood roofless for a few years during construction, as there was a bit of a cash flow gap, for example. And the gardens weren't as elaborate as they could have been because she just didn't have the resources. I feel that the odds are the ice house seat probably was a timber structure, and within 50 years or so was probably rotten to the point where it would have been pulled down, presumably by whoever inherited the estate after her and had no necessary love for that particular structure. And once pulled down and there were only the rotting stumps of the supports, for example, left in the ground, they will come out with the soil, and then clean soil will have gone back in, and it just disappears from history.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you so much for a really informative talk today. We really do appreciate it. And just those shameless plugs of the 18th of January for the 9-pin bowling alley. The 25th of January is by Judith Doby, and she's talking about being an illustrator for Historic England and illustrating Marble Hill. And on the 15th of February, at the same time of 6 o'clock, we've got our historic landscape archaeology. So do tune in for a little bit more. And we're very grateful for your time, Thomas, and for the archaeology that you've been doing on site.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Have a lovely evening, and we hope to see you at Marble Hill soon. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye all.